Thank you, Father Philip Neary, and to the whole ATI team for this invitation to speak. I'm very happy to be here participating in this conference. If you are familiar with Aquinas, you are likely aware that he has something which we often call a hierarchy of being at work. Often dubbed hierarchy, I prefer to call it simply a scale of being. This scale may have come from his reading of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. You may associate the hierarchy of being specifically with Dionysius, who is in fact the one who coined the word hierarchy, at least in a philosophical meaning. Now we know that he and Aquinas following him discuss other types of hierarchy, the ecclesiastical, angelic, celestial, and so forth. However, today I'm going to talk about the scale of being, or the hierarchy of being, considered philosophically. It's useful to think about this theme relative to Aquinas' sources for a few reasons. Thinking relative to sources helps us clarify what's actually being claimed and increases our own positive understanding of Aquinas' claims. It also helps us to identify where Aquinas' true contribution is to be found, where he, let's say, improves upon his sources. To begin, I want to problematize the notion a bit by asking this simple question: is hierarchy a Platonic or Aristotelian notion? If we stop to consider, we would probably likely associate it with Platonism. However, when it comes to discussing Aquinas' theory of cognition, as we're doing in this conference, hierarchy begins to appear like an Aristotelian notion. If a student of Aquinas were asked to illustrate the so-called hierarchy of being, he would likely have recourse to Aristotelian psychology. We typically delineate a hierarchy of souls, or the powers of souls, as vegetative, sensitive, and rational. Further, we can distinguish animals that have mere sensation from rational animals whose sensation terminates in a higher form of cognition, scientia, which is the fruit of abstraction and discursive reasoning. We can even move further if we wish to discuss the angels, talking about angelic epistemology and how that's to be seen on a kind of continuum or scale relative to human cognition. Again, the question is this a Platonic or Aristotelian notion? I think this question should bother us a bit. Maybe not keep you up at night, but perhaps at least bother you a bit throughout this talk. Isn't it a bit strange that we associate with Platonism this notion of hierarchy, but seem only capable of illustrating it properly by appealing to classic Aristotelian examples? Father Fabro claimed that Aquinas produced an emergent synthesis of Platonic and Aristotelian frameworks. Said specifically, and here he's quoting Durantel in his book on Pseudo-Dionysius and Aquinas, Father Fabro claims that when we discuss Aquinas' macroscopic vision of reality, it often has a Platonic structure to it. But we zoom in at a particular level, or relating one level to another, and Aquinas' structure seems to look more and more Aristotelian. So Father Fabro claims that it's Aquinas' genius to synthesize these two frameworks. I think there's a great deal of truth to this. However, I would like to further problematize things by indicating that this type of synthesis was well underway before Aquinas, and well underway even before Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, understood as a figure or a collection of authors writing in the early 6th century. So this is my main reason today for turning to Nemesius, a source that may seem rather obscure, but one that nonetheless formed a part of Aquinas' library of late antique texts. So who was Nemesius? De Natura Hominis, on the nature of man, is the sole work we have authored by a figure named Nemesius of Emesa. He has been hailed, or this work has been hailed, as the first text of Christian anthropology. That is understood in a broad philosophical sense, the first Christian anthropology. Now, while Nemesius mentions articles of the faith, as well as the positions of various heretics, we know that his text is not limited to a Christian audience. We know it's uncontroversial, according to the scholarly literature on Nemesius, to maintain that he directed his text not just to other Christians, but to a wider, even non-Christian audience. We can do this, we can date his text in part by looking at the mention of various heresies, and there is a relative consensus now that the text was authored somewhere between 390 and the early 400s. So understanding Dionysius, the Pseudo-Areopagite, as a figure coming from the 520s AD, when we think about Nemesius, we're talking about someone who's writing more than 100 years prior to Dionysius. Nemesius combines Platonic and Aristotelian anthropologies in a unique way. It's important to remember this time period of late antiquity produces a lot of sui generis figures with this fascinating original synthesis of philosophical ideas. If you've heard of Chalcidius and his commentary and translation of Plato's Timaeus, it's a similar figure who's producing his own synthesis. It's hard to associate with just one school. Synesius also comes to mind. Now, Nemesius uses a great deal of Aristotle at a time when Aristotle had come under suspicion by Christians. And one scholar even claims it's this addition of Aristotle, or this Aristotelian aspect of his thought, that allows us to see some of the first seeds of scholasticism sprouting. Another reason to bring Nemesius together with Aquinas is just this, that he displays that Aristotelian emphasis in combination with, let's say, some other Platonic theses. Nemesius has a thorough knowledge of the dangers of various Platonic positions and the dangers of various heresies, their Christological heresies of his day. But we see Nemesius, in his text, present an earnest and creative attempt to grapple with the unique reality of human nature. And he does so not just by appeal to Plato and Aristotle, but also a broad appeal to medical science and biology. So literature coming from the Galenic tradition, from Galen. In fact, one scholar has said he has the most extensive use of medical material in any patristic text. If we put him broadly under the umbrella of patristic writings. According to Nemesius, the human soul is capable of subsistence after death, and yet its union with the body cannot be regarded as an accidental union or a union of power, a virtual union. He uses various images, to describe the body-soul union, but he also qualifies them. So he notes, for example, that the body is the living instrument of the soul, but not merely an instrument. Likewise, the language of master and slave, that the soul is master over the body, or at least ought to be, even if there's a tendency downwards. The soul is master of the body, but not merely its master. Nemesius is critical of the Platonic doctrine of the transmigration of souls, and yet seems to maintain, be comfortable at least, with the idea of the pre-existence of souls, of human souls. So not everything that he says would fall clearly within the bounds of orthodoxy, as we understand it today, as we profess today. The mix of material in De Natura Hominis at times feels very eclectic, but nonetheless, there is a structure to the work, a rhyme and reason to the incorporation of this various material. And a recent author has argued, this is Dusenberry, who wrote just a few years ago the first full monograph on Nemesius in English. He claims one can clearly detect a three-part structure where Nemesius discusses the substance of human nature, power, and acts. So you can broadly detect that structure in the work. There are other themes. God's providence, his all-pervasive providence, is spoken of in the text. And the text concludes with a long discussion of human freedom. So Nemesius is a multifaceted author with a variety of influences. Just to say a bit more about him historically, he may have in fact been a provincial governor in Syria and then converted to the true faith. It's possible that he even practiced medicine because of the extensive medical knowledge he displays, but it's now, scholars generally believe, he just had a great amateur knowledge of this, or perhaps taught medical knowledge, but without practicing medicine itself. This wouldn't have been that uncommon in his day. The recent study by Dusenberry has underscored the legal and political aspects of Nemesius' thought, even calling him a cosmopolitan thinker. That has a specific meaning. The rich analogies that Nemesius makes between governance and the direction of the soul's powers indicate, in fact, a vision of reality patterned on civic life. And this has a heritage to it, this idea. He thinks of the world itself as a divinely governed city. His work was influential on Gregory of Nyssa's On the Creation of Man, or possibly the two of them drew more likely from a common source. We see similar material in either one. In terms of influence, however, we see a strong influence of Nemesius in John Damascene in his De Fide Orthodoxa. Now, late 19th and early 20th century scholarship tended to regard him, Nemesius, as a wholly derivative thinker. And here the huge name of Werner Jaeger comes up. He set the tone for that, being such a towering figure in the scholarship of his day. He's the one that authored the enormous work on paideia, on education in antiquity. He also dedicated a study to Nemesius, but with the conclusion that he can more or less be reduced to his sources and doesn't, in fact, present a novel contribution or synthesis. Jaeger points to Origen, but also Posidonius, a Stoic figure, as a source for Nemesius' thought. Jaeger points to the similarity between certain passages of Cicero's De Natura Deorum as conveying this common source with Posidonius. And I'll bring up one of those passages. As it happens, I'm teaching a course this semester on Cicero's De Natura Deorum, so this connection provided an excellent pretext to force my students to come to the conference. Now, these earlier works of source criticism have been challenged, and more recent scholarship has in fact underlined Nemesius' originality. Now, another thing to consider is that Nemesius had access to texts which are no longer extant to us, specifically texts falling in this sort of divide between what we could dub early and late Neoplatonism. So he mentions a text Iamblichus wrote against the transmigration of souls from human beings to animals. It's an interesting thing to think of, that often the later Neoplatonists are presenting a little more sensible anthropology. Also, he has texts at his disposal from Porphyry and one of Iamblichus' students, Theodore of Azine. So what does Aquinas take from Nemesius? Well, we need to remark that first, Aquinas thought De Natura Hominis to be written by Gregory of Nyssa. And some of what I mentioned shows us that in the sense that there are a lot of common ideas present in Gregory of Nyssa and in Nemesius' text. But it traveled under that name in Aquinas' day. Aquinas read a Latin translation of De Natura Hominis made by Burgundius of Pisa in 1165. And I mention that just to give us an idea that this is a text already present when Aquinas begins his studies, already a part of the accessible canon of texts. Now, Albert the Great happened to have read an earlier translation or version of Nemesius. We actually have a critical edition of the Burgundius of Pisa translation, which was produced in the 70s by Ferbecca and Mancho. And that's the text that I'm going to at least incorporate elements of in the quotations, then the text we'll look at. Aquinas takes from Nemesius under the name Gregory of Nyssa, information about several different Platonic positions. For example, the notion that souls are united to bodies through power and operation rather than substantially as matter and form. And so you may have heard of the classic quotation, attribution to Plato that the soul is as a sailor directing a ship, or that the body is a kind of clothing the soul puts on. These images Aquinas finds attested to in Nemesius. Also, a Platonic notion that sensation is an activity of the intellect alone. Also, some notion of the Platonic forms as secondary gods. So some discussion of what divinity means for Plato. There's also a reference to Plato's theory of divine providence that comes up in Nemesius, in which Aquinas uses then the text to attest to, because Nemesius himself refutes this view, having to do with the different ways in which providence is synchronized underneath God, underneath the highest principle. Now, do these constitute a significant impact on Aquinas' thought? I leave that as an open question. I will say that Robert Henley, whose excellent study, Aquinas and Platonism, Aquinas and the Platonists, in that study, he concludes that the texts of Nemesius make no appreciable difference to Aquinas' thought. He calls them mere tag quotations, in contrast to other Platonic sources that are more important for Aquinas. What else does Aquinas take from Nemesius? This will make up my contribution today, discussing what other things Aquinas may have taken from Nemesius. So those other things I mentioned, merit their own study. The way in which Nemesius is a Platonic informant for Aquinas, but I would like to focus in particular on one of the central images with which De Natura Hominis begins. What are we to make of the hierarchy of being, or the scale of being, and Aquinas' sources for it? Can we say that Nemesius is a source for Aquinas' notion of a scalar structure of reality? Well, today I would like to suggest that he very well may have been, especially if we consider some of the central themes of the work De Natura Hominis. And the two I would like to highlight today are the human soul, understood as a border, and man, understood as a microcosm. These are often put together, often discussed in the same place, but they really are formally distinct. The notion that the human soul marks out a kind of limit or border between material and immaterial reality, and that human nature taken together is a kind of synthesis, summary of all of creation. Man as the microcosm, or parvus mundus in Latin. So let's take at the opening chapter of Nemesius' De Natura Hominis. This is your first text. I put the Nemesius texts as numbers, or they're numbered, and the Aquinas texts are lettered. It is well known that man has something in common even with inanimate things, that he has a share in the life of non-rational animals, and that he participates in the thinking of rational beings. He is associated with inanimate things in virtue of the body and the mixture of the four elements, with plants, both in virtue of these things and in virtue of the power of growth and generation, with non-rational beings, both in virtue of these things and for good measure, in virtue of the movement by impulse of desire, spirit, and the power of sensation and breathing. So we can see recapitulated here the Aristotelian powers of souls, and those being sort of nested in. Whatever's possessed by the lower is possessed by the higher, albeit in a different mode. For all these are common to men and to non-rational animals, even if not all to all. But man is linked by rationality to the incorporeal and intellectual natures in reasoning and apprehending and judging each matter, pursuing the virtues, cherishing piety, the coping stone of the virtues. So he is, as it were, also on the boundary, medius, in Burgundius of Pisa's translation, or metharios, in the dative here, in the original, the boundary between intelligible and perceptual being. He is joined together with non-rational and inanimate beings in virtue of the body and bodily powers, and to incorporeal beings in virtue of reason, as was said earlier. For the Creator, Aquinas reading this would have saw the word conditor, but Nemesius' original text, in fact, says demiurgos, demiurge. The Creator appears to link together the different natures by small differences, so that the whole creation is one and akin, by which it is particularly evident that the Creator of all things is one. For he not only unified the existence of each individual thing, but he also linked them together with each other fittingly. And the fittingly here in the Latin is familiariter, but in the Greek original, oikeos, or a derivative of oikos, so an adverbialization of home, in a homely way, in a housely way, in a domestic way, an affinity of kinship of sorts. And this term has a Stoic heritage of a kind of nexus of providence and creation put together. So the key words here that I've underlined for you really demonstrate the point that there is a notion of material and immaterial, corporeal and incorporeal being bound together. The Latin word is copula there, sunapte in Greek. That man thus forms a midpoint, a medius, a middle term, even in other places, and that this has been done by the Creator, the demiurge. He's joined things together, and what he has done reveals his own oneness. So it's a kind of proof, not just of God's existence, but of the unicity of God, that things have an affinity one to the other, that he's joined creation together by small differences. Now, this is closely connected to a notion we also find in Aquinas, which we can call the principle of metaphysical continuity, or the law of mediation. It's difficult really to say where this idea starts, because Aquinas, as broad-minded as he is, seems to find justification for it already within Aristotle on the parts of animals, to say that nature doesn't make jumps. We don't see a jump from one type of being to a radically different type of being, but we can usually find some point of continuity between them. So, for example, we find between plants and animals capable of their own motion and sensation, certain animals that have sensation but no locomotion, such as oysters, or a very limited locomotion. Right? So he calls them imperfect animals. We might even see some heritage of this idea in the Timaeus, in the way that the demiurge binds together things with the world soul. Now, Nemesius seems to not be reducible just to some of these ancient sources, but actually to have contributed something new by all accounts. At least new, perhaps, to Aquinas. He has a more developed account than these rudimentary notions of a general order, a general unity in the visible order. Precisely because Nemesius introduces a properly Christian anthropology in this context. So while the notion of continuity and grades can be found inchoately in the Stoics, we see a clear anthropocentrism emerge in Nemesius by reconciling this insight with a graduated account of creation found in Genesis. Man is created last and is intended as the culmination of the visible world. And further, this continuity is a kind of signature of the Creator, a way in which we see final and efficient causality at work, that everything's created by one God and is ordered to one God. So it's interesting how, in a way, the same data that the ancients having more of a pantheistic model, the same data they observe is used here in a Christian context to prove a different point, the unicity of God, the oneness of God, a kind of signature of the Creator. So more important for this project, we can recognize a point at work in Aquinas with regard to this continuity, that he discusses frequently the interaction between grades of being and observes this continuity. this law of mean terms, that the highest species of a lower genus seems to anticipate, even says in some passages, to participate the perfections of the lowest species of the next higher genus. Certain plants anticipate animal characteristics, higher animals exhibit activities that seem to anticipate human intelligence, and so forth. I just want to suggest today that Nemesius may be a possible source for the principle of continuity in Aquinas. But we should consider a few other texts first before looking at Aquinas, or a single other text at least, text 2. Who then could rightly be surprised at the nobility of such an animal that binds together to him in himself mortal and immortal elements, and joins the rational with the non-rational, who carries in his own nature the image of the whole creation, for which reason he was also called a microcosm. The Greek is literally microcosmos, and the Latin, Burgundius of Pisa translation here, is parvus mundus. Who was thought, this is man, who was thought worthy of so great providence, for whom everything that is now and is to be, and for whom indeed God became man, who ends in incorruption and escapes immortality. He is king over the heavens, being born in the image and likeness of God. He communes with Christ, is a child of God, and surpasses all principalities and powers. Who could express the advantages of this living thing? He crosses the seas in contemplation. He enters into the heavens. He recognizes the motion of the stars, their intervals and their dimensions. He crops the earth and the sea. He thinks nothing of wild beasts and sea monsters. He controls every science, craft, and procedure. He gives order to the whole creation, instructs spirits, discovers the natures of things, concerns himself with God, and becomes the house and temple of God. This is, in fact, the passage that Jaeger points to as being derived almost completely from Posidonius, because we see something very similar to it at the end of Book 2 of Cicero's De Natura Deorum. Obviously, Cicero doesn't mention Christ. Posidonius didn't mention Christ. So I think we need to acknowledge that there's more than the mere appeal of sources here. There's actually something new. We can't reduce Nemesius crudely to his sources. Nonetheless, this text highlights the summarizing value of human nature, that man summarizes that entire scale of being and cognition, and that there further is a kind of isomorphism between the cosmos as a whole and man considered just in his nature. The isomorphism between the macrocosm and microcosm, the maior mundus, as it's called in Latin, and the parvus mundus. So what do we find in Aquinas? Well, I've given you several key texts arranged in chronological order in order to identify this language used throughout Aquinas' corpus. And I've been very cruel and not even given you the English translation, but I've, for your benefit, put in bold the Latin. Really, what's relevant in most of these first texts it's not so much the reasoning, but the key words, and that's why I've simply left it underlining the key words. We see, for example, already in Aquinas' sentences commentary, the prologue to the third book, which is very curious, uses a lot of language Aquinas took from the De Causis, but also here we have man spoken of as a medium between the two domains of reality, the spiritual and the corporeal. And we see this key word of horizon and border, confinium, horizon et confinium. Likewise, in that second text from Summa Contra Gentiles, and this really is one of the most interesting texts for Aquinas' anthropology. I would be so bold as to say, even for his hylomorphic theory, this text needs to be on the top list towards the beginning, among the most important texts, because he gives you an entire summary of matter and form, and he shows you that the human soul is not an exception to the hylomorphic theory. In a way, it's its best example. Because the higher and greater the form is, the greater the unity it communicates to matter. And thus, the human soul is not a kind of exception to the theory, but its best example. And towards the end of that text, he says that the human soul can be, again, thought of as a horizon or border between corporeal and incorporeal. Insofar as it is an incorporeal substance, yet nonetheless the form of a body. Moving further into two other important texts, of course, for Aquinas' anthropology, disputed questions on the soul and on spiritual creatures. And what I want to highlight with these texts is that Aquinas has no need to bring up this language. It's not like when he's answering an objection and the objector has used this word and he needs to explain it. He's choosing to bring it up almost as a metaphorical or poetic way to summarize the end of the session of his contribution, really talking about the soul. And so we see that language presented there too. Those two texts are not to be neglected. Especially in De Spiritualibus Creaturis, text D, he talks about the human soul as the most perfect of forms. And there we see his articulation of the principle of continuity, for which he typically quotes Dionysius, chapter 7 of the Divine Names. And there we see that the human soul is offered as a privileged example of this continuity at work, that the highest part of a lower order touches upon the lowest part of that neighboring next higher order. So I wanted simply to put those texts on the table, but mainly to highlight the keywords and the facts that Aquinas is bringing up this language, even, let's say, when he doesn't have to. So if we simply did an index Thomisticus search and we saw this language, we find actually it's the objectors or a different context where some of this language is arising. I've given you the text where really it's central to what he's saying. I want to turn now to the commentary on the De Causis, where we find Aquinas' clearest explanation of this language, which is itself present in the De Causis, the soul as a horizon. So if you turn to text E, which I've kindly translated for you this time, so the second paragraph is in English. A horizon is a circuit, circulus, as far as the eye can see, and is the lowest boundary of the higher hemisphere, yet the origin, the principle of the lower hemisphere. And similarly, the soul is the last boundary of eternity and the origin of time. So he's needing to grapple with the language of the De Causis, which is at times very confusing. And he's not only doing that, explaining, well, in a certain sense you can understand this. He's kind of confidently employing this language, which recurs several times throughout that work. Let's look at text F. Moreover, orders of this sort have a certain continuity among one another, since they proceed from one first principle, such that the order of bodies touches upon the order of souls. Attingere is an important word here. And the order of souls touches upon the order of intellects, which itself touches upon the order of divine things. Now, the context, I have to confess here, is Aquinas is explaining the Platonic noetic triad as he's discovered it articulated in Proclus's Elements, Proposition 102. But I've saved that for later. I've taken that part out here, just to know that he is using this not only to discuss, let's say, his own anthropology, but to orient himself in a very Platonic world, that is, Proclus and the De Causis. Let's look at text G. The order of things proceeds in such a way that similar things follow upon one another, but those things that are utterly dissimilar cannot follow one another in the grades of things. So nature does not make jumps, except through some medium. Just so we see that a perfect animal and a plant are utterly dissimilar one from another, for a perfect animal has sensation and is mobile with progressive motion, while a plant has neither of these. Therefore, nature does not proceed immediately from perfect animals to plants, but produces imperfect animals in between, in medio. So again, the key word he would have read in Burgundius of Pisa's translation of Nemesius, which shares sensation with animals, but immobility with plants. Thus, it is necessary to posit some middle, and the context here he's discussing basically the hierarchy. I've violated my own rule. I've said hierarchy. The scale of being, all the way up discussing the celestial bodies and even higher realities. And the thought at this point is, well, the celestial bodies can be a kind of intermediate point between properly immaterial being and, let's say, temporal being subject to corruption. It's necessary to posit some middle between these two extremes that might be similar to either extreme, just as the grades of things proceed through similar things. Now, what becomes interesting in the commentary is that Aquinas won't settle for the celestial bodies as a fitting intermediate between properly immaterial realities and corruptible ones. Thus, he says there's a necessity for the human soul, seen from this principle at least. There's a necessity that the human soul be a kind of fitting intermediate. Now, the context here, he's discussing time and eternity, which is on a scale, and that's one of the more complicated ideas in the De Causis, is these various grades of eternity. And actually having to comment on the De Causis forces Aquinas, using Marbeck's new translation of Proclus, forces him to have to use new terminology to actually account for more grades than Aquinas himself would have created, so to speak, would have accounted for. Why is that relevant here? Well, just to indicate he's using the same idea but applying it here to the time-eternity scale rather than talking about Aristotelian psychology. Oddly enough, it has the result, if you carry his argument and make it more explicit, that he's calling human beings effectively the oysters of eternity. So if you want to name a rock band that name, you have my permission. We are, in virtue of our composite nature, the oysters of eternity, in the sense that we have a beginning, we have a permanent subsistence, and yet nonetheless, we're bound by time and motion, insofar as we're bound by our corporeal nature as well, yet not wholly limited to that of the corporeal. The last text I have for you, H, is, I think, the most mature and, let's say, the greatest insight into Aquinas' synthesis on these matters. Because he not only delineates, let's say, the more Platonic reading of this principle in terms of the triad of being, life, and intellect, but he also integrates that, in a way, builds it from the ground up in an Aristotelian fashion. So we'll take a close look at this text. All grades of things seem to reduce to three: being, life, and intellect. And the same way, any given thing can be considered in a threefold way. First, as it is in itself, secundum se, and thus how its own being befits it. Second, insofar as it tends to something else, and thus how it befits it to be moved by itself. And third, according to the other things it has in itself, and thus it befits it to know, since knowledge is perfected insofar as the known is in the knower, not materially but formally. Furthermore, just as having something in itself formally and not materially, which constitutes the nature of knowledge, is the most noble mode of having or containing something, so too to be moved by oneself is the most noble mode of mobility, and this constitutes the nature of life. For we call that which can move itself in some way a living being. Therefore, being is first and common to all things, but not all things attain to the perfection by which they might be self-moving, only living things, in other words. Thus, not all things are living, but only those which are more perfect among beings. You could go further and flesh that out further with intellect. What's interesting here, just to back up something that was already said in the previous talk, that Aquinas does use the language of cognition for talking about animal knowledge. But again, that's not the perfect possession of a new form intellectually immaterial within oneself. So what type of provisional conclusions can we offer looking at these texts? Well, I began by problematizing the so-called hierarchy of being as both Platonic and Aristotelian, depending on how we look at it. And I think Fabro is right to say that Aquinas did produce a synthesis of these things. I just want to highlight that his sources were already well underway in doing such a task. So when we might ask, was Nemesius an important source for Aquinas? I think we can see the congruence of the ideas, even just on a limited number of texts. And it's helpful to know this isn't just a book we know he had, it's a book we know he cites, and even the same chapter from that book, even if he doesn't cite that particular passage. So Aquinas had a patchwork of sources, and it's important for us to recall that. Although he prefers to connect this idea to the authority of Dionysius, typically citing again from Book 7 of the Divine Names, he probably had good reason to prefer Dionysius for this, thinking of him as chronologically prior in time. I've tried to show that there is this synthesis in Nemesius, the idea that the principle of continuity is a sort of signature of the Creator, of his unicity, and that the human soul is a privileged example of that principle and holds creation together, so to speak. So that shorthand language of horizon or summary helps us orient man in creation and is a part of a larger vision. If Aquinas already had sources that synthesize the Platonic structure with Aristotelian psychology, where does his own contribution lie? Well, I believe it lies rather in the integration of these sources and also the integration of them with his own notion of metaphysics, with his own notion of the metaphysics of participation and intensive essay, because we would need to give the full story from Aquinas' perspective to discuss the composition of essence and essay and how that plays out. And that's where, for example, studying the disagreements between Father Geiger and Fabro would be useful. But I just want to hint at that as a further thing that really where Aquinas' novel elements lie. I do think, just to end on a practical word, there's a practical value to discussing these matters and these sources because it helps us argue for a healthy anthropocentrism on philosophical grounds. To say, just from a philosophical perspective, before we introduce revelation, what can we say is exceptional about man and his place in creation, and let's say the stewardship that behooves him in light of that. So it's useful for us to consider this original Christian anthropology, how Aquinas adapted it, and therefore how we may use it too. Thank you.